Well, J. Andrew Brown is an associate professor of Spanish at Washington University in St. Louis. His research focuses on the intersections of scientific, technological, and literary discourse in Latin American cultural production. Professor Brown's current project examines the cultural articulations of cyborg and posthuman identity in Latin America as a strategy for critiquing and surviving and understanding neoliberalism in the post-dictatorship era. His previous publications include Test Tube Envy, Science and Power in Argentine Narrative, and the edited volume Tecnoscritura, Literatura y Tecnología en América Latina in 2007, as well as several articles on contemporary Latin American narrative and film. Brown has lectured widely on his research in the United States, Latin America, and Europe. He received a BA in Spanish and the History of Science from the University of Oklahoma and an MA and PhD from the University of Virginia. Andrew and his wife, Amy, are the parents of 4 children, and also has taught a number of interesting courses that might be helpful for you. He's taught a freshman seminar in comparative literature, Latin American film, Argentine cinema, and I understand an upcoming course, a good reason to move to St. Louis, The Philosophy of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Today we're very pleased to welcome Professor Brown here to campus. It's a great personal honor. I knew Andrew many years ago when he lived here in Utah, and we're very pleased to welcome him back. He'll be speaking, as I said, on Southern Cyborgs, Posthuman Identity in Latin America. Please join me in welcoming Professor J. Andrew Brown.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I'm really grateful to Corey for the invitation to come. I don't get to come back to Utah very often. I think the last time I was here was in 2000, and so it's really nice to be able to be back here and visit. No, it's 75 degrees in St. Louis, so I did not, but it was nice to have it here welcoming me. Well, I guess. So over the course of my career, I've been really interested in the way that science and technology, and especially the way that society perceives science and technology, helps shape and is shaped by literary discourse. The way that we use literature to think through not only the implications of science, but the actual elaboration of scientific truths, but also the way that that in turn shapes the literature that gets produced. Using literature as a means to, Kathryn Hales talks about literature as the ideal laboratory for being able to think deeply about the different kinds of truths and constructions of truths that occur in science and occur in technology. And so my first book was about how power and societal and cultural power is exercised through science and through literature in the way that they came together in Argentina. While I was working on that, I started to notice that there were lots of either actual living robots that were wandering through Argentine literature or moments in which identity was founded on these intersections of the organic and technological. And so the book project that I'm finishing up right now looks not only at how that works through in Argentina, but in a broader Latin American context. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about cyborgs and their societal function in cultural production, both a little bit here in the U.S., mostly in Latin America. And then I'm going to take 2 novels and look at them a little more closely. One's a kind of hybrid science fiction noir novel from Argentina, and the other is a novel that's not science fiction from Bolivia. But in both cases, we see how this kind of cyborg, and that is cybernetic organism, that kind of identity that comes from the combination of the technological and the organic, how those are used in ways that invite us to rethink our vision of the cyborg, especially the one that gets constructed in recent North American and European cultural theory. Now, if you start to pay a lot of attention to cyborgs and that, as I have in the last few years, you start to realize that artificial life and cyborgs appear in the literature at important transitional moments in society. And so one of the most obvious cyborgs that we have is Frankenstein, one that becomes more cyberneticized in the film than it does in the novel. You have these little bolts to remind you that he is also technological, whereas in the novel you get more of a stitching together of corpses. But that's something that in Shelley you see arise right at the end of the Enlightenment and in the transition to the age of science in the 19th century, where people were beginning to take pause and wonder whether all of this was really such a good idea or no. And what you have then is the image of this hybridized artificial life that arrives at a way that exists outside of the normal modes of procreation, as a way to warn of the potential problems of science, and also as a way to use an image that allows you to think through all of those implications. And we see that recur, especially through the 19th and the 20th century. If you fast forward into the 1950s and 60s, you'll see a lot of movies that have to do with killer robots. And I took an image of the Daleks from Doctor Who that are these horrible robots that have a little bit of life inside of them of an alien race, but that all goodness has been stripped out of them and all they can do is hate. And it appears these kind of killer robots, and specifically the narratives of great human beings that fight against and defeat the evil robots, becomes a way to think through the different advances in technology that were seen as dehumanizing. And so you find, especially in science fiction, a kind of comforting narrative in which the human is reaffirmed because it's able to beat back the terrible robots that are trying to take over the world. If we jump forward another few decades, we find ourselves now in a situation in which much of computer technology is starting to blur the line between what is human subjectivity and what is artificial intelligence, to the extent that in many times we've really blurred those demarcation lines between the wholly organic and the hybridized vision of a mechanical human. And so one television series that has really thought through this in interesting ways is Battlestar Galactica. I want to show you the opening clip from season 2 where they have their little story that they tell. And I want you to pay attention to the way that that cybernetic life is presented once again as a threat. And this appears at the beginning of all of the episodes of Battlestar Galactica. As the narrative goes on, they change a couple of the things that they say. But by and large, it's the Cylons were created, they rebelled, they killed pretty much all of the humans, and they still have a plan to do something terrible to us. What's interesting here, I think, is that we've moved from an image of the killer robot that humans will ultimately defeat, to kind of a mixture of the killer robot with the Frankenstein situation, in which Frankenstein's monster acts as the revenge upon the hubris of the scientist. Here we have this narrative that, if you note in the remake of Battlestar Galactica, it's very different from the original Battlestar Galactica, where the Cylons were these aliens that just hated the humans because they were aliens. And now it's this idea of humans of having, through this desire to always go forward in technology, creating a artificial life that ends up killing them. You get that same narrative in a lot of recent science fiction, from The Matrix to all sorts of different points. What I'm interested in here is the way that not only do you have these monstrous robots that are there shooting their guns at you, but that part of the threat comes from the fact that you're not able to distinguish between human and machine. And that there are many copies, and you see all of these people that are not obviously cyborgs, represents part of the threat to what it is to be human. When you can no longer tell what is human and what is not, then society as a whole is forced to rethink the way that they conceive of human subjectivity. Now, in Latin America, you get a lot of the same and different at the same time, which is usually what happens when you talk about Latin America. Let's see. Sam, do you want to hit the space bar? Okay. And so I wanted to go briefly take you through a similar timeline, and we'll go very quickly because I wanted to spend most of the time on the novel, but and show you where cyborgs have appeared at a situation that is at times one that reproduces the kinds of fears that you see in U.S. and European literature, as well as some moments that are quite different. Now, when you look at contemporary cyborg theory that's been done in the last 15 or 20 years, the image from Latin America that most commonly appears is Diego Rivera's mural Pan American Unity, which he did in San Francisco for an exposition in 1940s. I'm just showing you a detail of that mural here, which is this kind of very optimistic vision of the combination of the Americas, where you have the kind of spiritualized vision of the Latin American, Indian, mystical elements that kind of come in from one side and the industrial North from the other. And that the Pan-American unity then is presented as this cyborg figure that is neither wholly robot nor organic, but because of the way that Latin America and the U.S. get stitched together, has to be portrayed with this cybernetic figure that is not monstrous, except in the fact that it is not human. But the way in which you get the combination of the robot with the sign of peace from a more indigenous perspective, and if you can see the rest of it, you see the kind of workers and this idea of a good proletariat coming from Latin America mixing in with the industrial North is really quite a positive vision of this. Something that stands at odds to most of the cyborgs that you're seeing in the 20th century in the U.S., where generally they are bad things that we either made by accident and now they're coming after us, or they're just bad and they want to come after us anyway. So Diego Rivera is separate from that. But if you look over the course of how specifically cyborg figures appear in Latin America, and specifically Argentina, and the rest of my examples are from Argentina, partly because that's where I spend most of my time thinking, but also because it seems there's more of a tradition there. You get one of the very first science fiction texts in Argentina that was published in the 1870s by Eduardo Homburg, who was a medical doctor and an aspiring writer. He has a short story called Horacio Caliban o los Automata, in which you get there's this meeting of intellectuals where they start to hear stories about these people that aren't actually people, these automatons that are indistinguishable but have begun to infiltrate society. A little bit like Battlestar Galactica, but what Homburg was worried about was more the increased immigration into Argentina, and the fact that the definitions of what made someone Argentine was undergoing important shifts as you got these waves of Italian and Spanish immigrants coming in the 1870s, 1880s, all through the end of the 19th century. There, the cyborg then becomes a menacing figure because of the way it represents the other and this encroachment of the other. If you jump forward a couple of decades into a longer novella by the Uruguayan writer Horacio Quiroga, who's quite well known, you have this fascinating Frankenstein story called El Hombre Artificial, which basically follows a Frankenstein situation with a Latin American twist in that you have these three scientists who want to make artificial life. They make it, but they can't get it to wake up. They realize that the only way to make it wake up is to have it experience the pain of life, and so one guy decides that they should kidnap a homeless man and torture him and transfer the pain into the monster. It creates a monster who can't survive because it is so incredibly sensitive to pain, and it ends up killing the scientist as well. So kind of a typical Frankenstein-type story where the scientist creates artificial life, shouldn't have, and dies because of it, but it mixes in that fear or that idea of torture and pain as a basis of experience, something that, especially in Argentina, and at that point Quiroga was writing in Argentina, anticipates some of the political oppression of the anarchists and the torture that would begin there that became an important part of Argentine life, and that was already there. We can remember, for example, Esteban Echeverria's novella El Matadero, where you have political oppression and torture during the 1830s and 40s. Going ahead, though, you start to see the robot and mechanical life transferred or applied to the ideas of capitalism, and especially from the Marxist viewpoint, the idea that the capitalists and the bourgeoisie are this kind of mechanical thinking that's out to extinguish life. And so the scientist turned writer Ernesto Sabato was very interested in thinking about dehumanization as a function of capitalism. And in his book, Hombres y Engranajes, which is more of a long essay, he uses lots of images of artificial life and mechanical life as part of the encroaching threat of modernization, how that's going to dehumanize us and how we need to fight against that. In another example, you can't read it very well. H.G. Oesterheld in the 1960s and 70s wrote probably the most important graphic novel in Latin America of the time, called El Eternauta, about a time traveler from the future who works his way through Argentina and thinks through a lot of different topics. You can't really see it in here, and it's really dialogue heavy. But there, the robot and artificial life became agents of the state. And in 1960s and 1970s Argentina, where you've got this Marxist uprising that's working against the anti-communist dictatorships at the time, you see how the mechanized state becomes a very important image against which the leftists would work. And Oesterheld is an important example of that. He, in addition to writing his graphic novels, was a montonero, which is one of the armed Marxist Peronista groups of the 60s and early 70s. And indeed, he disappeared during the Dirty War in the mid-70s. So that gets you a sense of the way that that the cyborg figure has worked in the past, both in how we think about cyborgs and robots, and a little bit about how it was working through in Latin America, noting that these kinds of things in Latin America, what you'll see is ideas that get repeated from sources in Europe or in the U.S., but ideas that get transformed. Now let's look as we get into the 1990s in a situation in which technology is much more present and the mechanical is much more present in daily life. We also get a series of attempts to try to theorize what it means to be cyborg and what it means to be what they call post-human, this idea that we've evolved to a point beyond just the organic and human to an idea of identity that exists in the dialogue between the organic parts of ourselves and the mechanical parts of ourselves. One of the major theorists in this is Donna Haraway. And she is writing from the perspective of a historian of science who's also a very strong feminist thinker. And so she creates this idea of the cyborg as a kind of new feminist icon. She has a cyborg manifesto in which she celebrates the hybridity of the cyborg as a model for thinking beyond hierarchies of male and female, masculine and feminine, etc. I wanted to give you a couple of quotes just to see, so that you get a sense of where she's coming from. So, this cyborg is a cybernetic organism, a hybrid of machine and organism, a creature of social reality as well as a creature of fiction. Social reality is lived social relations, our most important political construction, a world-changing fiction. What I wanted to emphasize out of this is this idea of the way that we create the cyborg in our efforts to think through what it means to be human, but what it means to be a society. And so when you see this kind of idea of a political construction, a world-changing fiction that then emphasizes the hybridity and the way that boundaries between science fiction and social reality break down, this becomes a very important idea for her, where she sees the main problem of feminism being these kind of hierarchical structures and limits that keep people apart. She has this idea of unity and of hybridity, not so much unity, of a hybridity that occurs in the mixing. And so she'll say things like, the cyborg in myth appears in myth precisely where the boundary between human and animal is transgressed. Far from signaling a walling off of people from other living beings, cyborgs signal disturbingly and pleasurably tight coupling. And she's very interested in this kind of fusion and the way that that kind of fusion subverts general societies, and so, or the way that societies are structured, with the idea that for her, the kind of masculine hierarchies that control society are a bad thing, and she wants to try to move beyond that. The cyborg then holds the promise of the breaking down of those kind of walls, and you see then this idea of the cyborg not being the robot that destroys life, or perhaps, the robot is this thing that destroys life as we know it, but from her perspective, that's a good thing. Now, one of the important elements of this kind of cyborg is the elimination of origin stories. Get this to... Sam, can you hit the spacebar again? She sees the cyborg as holding the promise to going beyond the kind of Judeo-Christian origin stories that she blames for a lot of the feminist struggles, and emphasizes the idea of the way that the cyborg is born of the military-industrial complex, the drive towards science and technology of that, but the way that that mixes and then subverts it. And so since it is no longer a creation that fits within the Judeo-Christian idea of creation, it becomes this promise of an alternative reality. For that reason, then, she mentions that the cyborg would not recognize the Garden of Eden. It is not made of mud and cannot dream of returning to dust. Their fathers, after all, are inessential. Are all about how this cyborg then erases the origins, erases past, and offers this new way to think through life and new way to organize society. And that's, in cyborg theory, become one of the more persuasive ways to think about how cyborgs are used, especially in cultural production in the United States and Europe. Now, she's probably one of the more radical people that think about this. A person who thinks through these ideas with much less of an agenda is Kathryn Hales, whose book, How We Became Posthuman, looks at the history of cybernetics and the history of literature to think about how we develop a subjectivity that goes beyond organic embodiment to one that is this dialogue between the organic and the technological. For Hales, she's more interested in understanding how we started to think that way, how we began to conceive of ourselves as beings where part of our memory is inside of our PDA, where we think nothing of the fact that when we receive vaccinations, we've been turned into cyborgs in the sense that we've used technology to alter our bodies, when we don't think anything of putting on glasses and using prosthetic eyes. All of these things for her are emblems of what it means to be posthuman, and it's neither feminist nor not feminist, it just is, and she's interested in seeing how we got there. One citation that kind of explains how she sees this is this idea that the posthuman view configures human beings so that it can be seamlessly articulated with intelligent machines. In the posthuman, there are no essential differences or absolute demarcations between bodily existence and computer simulation, cybernetic mechanism and biological organism, robot teleology, and human goals. And again, while Haraway would take the next step and say, that's what makes the cyborg a great feminist hero, Hales is much more interested in the reality of the posthuman existence and understanding how we got there. Now, what has been the focus of my research is seeing what happens when, being informed by these ideas of cyborg identity and posthuman subjectivity, what happens when we start to read Latin American literature or look at Latin American cultural production and begin to see ideas of the cyborg that make sense to a certain extent within what we're seeing in this kind of theory, but at the same time provide images of the cyborg that make us question much of what they're talking about, especially in the case of Donna Haraway. And to do that, I want to talk about two novels that have both won awards in their respective countries. One is, La Ciudad Ausente, The Absent City, by Ricardo Paglia, that was published in 1992 and won the Premio Planeta, has been, actually as a novel, for one published so recently, to already have dozens of critical articles written about it is quite a feat. It's a novel that's had quite a bit of an impact in literary studies. The other novel that I'll talk about is El Delirio de Tooting, Torrhens Delirium, from the Bolivian writer Edmundo Pozzolan. To tell you a little bit about this, this novel I think is fascinating. It's written in some 10 years after the end of the Dirty War. And it's a novel in which Paglia combines all of his literary interests. We have a journalist who is also a detective named Junior, an Anglo-Argentine, who suddenly discovers that there is apparently a machine that is producing news before it happens. So you'll hear a story about a violent event or a crime. He'll take it to publish it in the newspaper, and people will think that that Junior is committing the crimes because he's able to publish it as it happens or even a little bit before that. Well, as a good journalist, he's interested in figuring out what's about this machine, and the novel then takes him through a journey that leads him to, first of all, through a series of short stories that are these stories that the machine is apparently producing, then to a museum that is kind of an audiovisual representation of the stories that he's reading, to a machine, the machine that's in the bottom of that museum, which is a machine that has the consciousness of the dead wife of an Argentine writer, Macedonio Fernandez, who is producing all of these stories. He then takes a detour through some of the islands in Tigre, which is that Paraná Delta that is like a wilderness of Venice. If you've ever been to Tigre, you'll know what I mean. But it's this city that's laid out in islands without actually being a city. But there you find an island where everybody has decided that Joyce's Finnegan's Wake is the Bible, and they try to organize their lives around that. And then through a history of torture and oppression in Argentina. The novel has been read mostly as a tool for mourning. This idea of the absent city as a symbol of the different absences that were occasioned by the military dictatorship of the late 70s and early 80s. And this as a gesture in the post-dictatorship of thinking through the kind of traumatic effects that this had on Argentine society and Argentine consciousness. Now, obviously, I'm very interested in a novel whose one of whose main figures is this machine with the consciousness of a woman inside. And in fact, as soon as it was published, people started championing this book as an Argentine example of Donna Haraway's vision of the cyborg, in that it was machine, the consciousness of a woman, who produced stories that destabilized the state. And that was something that that got talked about in quite a bit of the literature. But I'd like to go a little bit farther than that, because I think it's just too easy to try to see it as just an example of what Donna Haraway was talking about. And so we're going to go through a couple of quotations. I put the quotations in English on the handout. I'm going to show you the quotations in Spanish because I'm a Spanish professor and I like the original a little bit more. Plus, there's a couple of places where the translations are infelicitous. But the first thing that we see is the idea of cyborg as writer, the cyborg as producer of texts. Obviously, the machine is what's producing these different stories that not only Junior publishes as a journalist, but that start to appear throughout the novel and destabilize even the very structure of that novel. When Junior first discovers the nature of this machine, I want to just show you that point where he discovers that. He's in conversation with a woman who's telling him a little about the museum. And I'm interested here en fuiste al museo ya, hay una máquina, ¿sabes o no? En todo eso hay algo muy raro. Yet. Todo es científico, nada maligno. Una vez conocí a un tal ruso que había inventado un pájaro de chapa que anunciaba la lluvia. Esto es igual, ciencia pura, no religión. No, dijo Junior, la máquina es una mujer, era una mujer. La encerraron. Now note that the way that it's translated from, at the end it says they locked her up. I actually prefer a broader meaning of la encerraron to they enclosed her. Because it means they locked her up, and they did to a certain extent. But they also enclosed her in the machine. And I think Paglia is trying to get at both of those ideas at the same time. What we see here is this idea of the construction of the mechanical, but the fact that it's an important aspect, or an important part of the aspect of this machine is the organic that's within it. That is, era una mujer, la encerraron. But the idea also that this is something that is an obvious result of scientific progress and technological process, where you get the image of this kind of tin bird that is able to predict the weather. The idea of these images of life and technology that have some kind of usefulness is also attached into its own creation. And so you get this kind of image that starts out very early in the novel and that then predominates as you work forward. But that's not the only way that it's presented. In one of the stories that gets told, you get this part called los nudos blancos, the white knots or the white nodes, that tells the story of a woman who is in a psychiatric institution who's subjected to electroshock therapy. And as the story is told within the novel, you start to understand that the doctor who is treating her with electroshock therapy is most likely one of the torturers of the Dirty War who would use the cattle prod and different kind of electric shock as part of their, as part of the instruments of torture. And there's a scene in which he is questioning her that you begin to see how the mechanical, this idea of the cyborg begins to be attached to this scene of torture, and specifically the scene of the application of electricity to the body of the victim. If it'll come up. Okay. Hay que operar, dijo. Tenemos que desactivar neurológicamente. Arregla televisores, dijo Elena. Ya sé, dijo Arana, quiero nombres y direcciones. Hubo una pausa en el consultorio, los vidrios blancos del armario reflejaban el vaivén del ventilador. Hay un telépata, dijo Elena, me sigue y me lee los pensamientos. Se llama Luca Lombardo, viene de Rosario, todos los dicen el Tano. Si digo lo que usted me pregunta, va a hacer estallar las microesferas que tengo implantadas en el corazón. Now, up to that point, note the way that the language is working. The doctor and Elena are both Arana and Elena are thinking about the body in mechanical terms. When he says we're going to have to deactivate you neurologically, he uses a kind of vocabulary that suggests the idea of consciousness as something that is mechanical, something that can be activated or deactivated. Elena kind of responds to that and begins to talk about the different implants that she has apparently in her, though this seems to be a manifestation of her own possible insanity. And so you have this kind of language in which they're both talking about the body as cybernetic, at the same time that you have the background scenes that also emphasize this kind of idea of reproduction and that is duplication and the mechanical, so that when he asks the question that is kind of the standard question of the torturer, I want names and addresses, then we have this pause where in los vidrios blancos del armario reflejaban el vaivén del ventilador, we have this moment in which glass is reflecting images and producing this duplication, and the duplication is of a mechanical process, the kind of circular fan motion that's occurring. And so Paglia is implanting this kind of cybernetic discourse both within the dialogue and within the scenes that we see around this moment. Now, as it continues, no sea imbécil, dijo Arana, se ha vuelto psicótica y tiene un delirio paranoico. Estamos en una clínica de Belgrano y esto es una sesión prolongada con drogas. Usted es Elena Fernández, se detuvo y leyó la ficha. Trabaja en el Archivo Nacional, tiene 2 hijos. Estoy muerta. Él me trasladó aquí. Soy una máquina. Vamos a tener que aplicarle un electroshock, le dijo Arana al médico que tenía cara de bebé. And we have then this moment that all of this dialogue, all of these images culminate then in this act of applying the electroshock, in using the electroshock therapy that literally combines the organic flesh of the victim in this case with the technology of the electroshock. Now, the other element that you have then in the construction of Paglia's cyborgs spacebar again, is the idea of the way that this, the trauma that occurs at the moment of torture, and at the moment of torture that emphasizes the combination of technology and body, is one that then it becomes, that creates a new kind of body, a new kind of cybernetic body, that can then serve as a testimony of what has occurred. That is, the cyborg whose identity rests in the communication between organic and technological prosthesis, then is a kind of text in and of itself that constantly testifies of the trauma that occasioned its existence. And so, in the final quote from this novel that I wanted to share with you, we have Mechadonio, who's a real writer. Mechadonio Fernandez is fairly well known, especially now, writer in Argentina, who is thinking through his own experience of the death of his wife and talking to a Russian friend who's also kind of interesting. So, Mechadonio se sentía un hermano del impetuoso Raxarov, que estaba hecho de metal más que de vida. Su dentura de acero centelleaba al hablar. Bajo su peinado había una placa de plata, un enrejado de oro entretejía un tatuaje tridimensional en medio de los leves despojos de cartílago y hueso que le quedaban en la articulación de la rodilla derecha, un sello de dolor hecho a mano, cuya forma siempre sentirá como un recuerdo doloroso, y a la vez el círculo de fuego libertario, una condecoración de combate que llevaba con el máximo orgullo por ser invisible y estar grabada en su cuerpo. And this body that Raxarov has is very interesting in the sense that the metal plate in his head, his teeth, all of these different parts that have literally made him a cyborg, are then things that, for him, are emblems of his war wounds and something of which he's proud. But it comes almost to that idea of when you, for example, when my children look at some of the scars I have, and I have to tell them the story of how I cut my finger on a glass when I was washing it or something, and they're interested in how these scars make up the stories of my past. We have this idea of the cyborg body as one whose prostheses carry stories within them that tell of the pain that happened when the different kind of trauma occurred that made him lose part of his skull or lose his teeth or whatever. And that these then turn the body into something that is no longer completely human, but also something that constantly signifies. Now, Mechadonio había quedado así, metálico, maltrecho, sostenido con operaciones y prótesis, el mismo dolor, el mismo cuerpo rehecho artificialmente, porque Elena de golpe estaba ausente. Congelado, de aluminio, caminaba con los brazos y la pierna separados del cuerpo como un muñeco de metal. No podía sonreír ni alzar la voz. And here we have an interesting development as well in the idea that for Mechadonio, this kind of post-human or cyborg identity is not dependent upon literal prosthesis. He doesn't need the metal plate in his head to feel like a cyborg or these fake teeth. The fact of the death of his wife also turns him into this kind of traumatized cyborg figure that feels mechanical, and whose mechanical feeling is a constant reminder of the loss that turned him into that. Now, as we think back to the way that Haraway champions her feminist cyborg, we realize that while what Paglia is presenting here is a subversive figure, that is, now we have a cyborg, and when we return to Elena, who is this cybernetic figure who is apparently cybernetic because of the torture that she has suffered, she subverts society. She questions ideas about how, especially the dictatorship and the post-dictatorship and different policies of trying to forget the past, she certainly does subvert all of that, but she subverts that because she does not forget her origin. So where Haraway Cyborg is powerful because it eliminates these origin mythologies that she calls, the Paglia Cyborg is subversive because it does not forget. And I think that that's an especially important way to think about how cyborg imagery is used, especially in Argentina. And there's a number of other texts where you get this idea of the cyborg figure as one that is that works against cultures of forgetfulness, of trying to kind of gloss over the traumatic past of the dictatorship, but that exists only because it never forgets its origin. It never forgets who its father and its mother is, and whose power comes from that origin myth or story. Now, the other novel that I want to talk about briefly is El Delirio de Tooting, and from Edmundo Pozzolan. There we go. He actually has a series of novels that he's written that have these kinds of images of combinations of mechanical and human life, but from a very different perspective from what we see in Paglia. Edmundo Pozzolan comes from a much younger generation. Paglia is born in the early 1940s and has one particular experience of Latin America and of the dictatorship. Pozzolan is born in 1967 and grows up during kind of a technological transition, moment of transition in society. He, as a Bolivian writer, and is one of the most well-known Bolivian writers of his generation, has a series of novels that are set in a fictional town called Rio Fugitivo, which is his version, I guess, of Garcia Marquez's Macondo. In this series of novels, he's especially interested in a peculiarity of Bolivian history, which is that Bolivia is the only Latin American country to elect one of its former dictators. The dictator was Hugo Banzer, and who participated in, ran the coup in 1971, and as part of the, how do we say this in Spanish? Operation Condor, was one of the anti-communist dictatorships of the 70s that, while not nearly as oppressive as Argentina or Chile, was responsible for several political murders and a number of desaparecidos. He then loses power in 1977 and immediately starts trying to get reelected. And in 1997, he does get reelected and is remade as a constitutionally elected democratic president who, as part of many of the regimes in Latin America of the 1990s, follows a neoliberal course of buddying up to the United States, cooperating in the drug war, and privatizing most of the different industries. In fact, Hugo Banzer had the water wars of 2000, where they privatized the waterworks of Cochabamba. Prices immediately went through the roof, and he didn't last very much longer as president. But what Hugo Banzer offers and what Edmundo Pozzolan picks up on, because in these series of novels, one of his main characters is a president called Montenegro, who has the exact same biography as Hugo Banzer, is the way that this particular political personage can help us think through the similarities between the neoliberal democracies of the 1990s and the military dictatorships of the 1970s. And so what we see in the novels of Edmundo Pozzolan are a series of moments in which he uses the different kinds of neoliberal situations to think through how things haven't changed that much from the dictatorship and how different kinds of political oppression continue to manifest themselves. I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly, so I'm not going to go through each of the different quotes, though you have them there. Speaking about Torrhens Delirium, just briefly, it's a fascinating novel because when he wrote it, Pozzolan said, that he was trying to write a novel that examined the culpability of the bureaucrats in a dictatorship. Those people that never tortured anyone, that never, went out and actively kidnapped or murdered anyone, but whose work within the political structure of the dictatorship contributed to the torture and deaths of people in that society. And so he focuses on Miguel Sainz, whose nickname is Tooting, from Alan Turing, who is a cryptographer. And he, during the 1970s, he decrypted messages from leftists and passed it on, and then that would result in their kidnappings and deaths. But that he never paid attention to that because he was much more interested in just solving the puzzle. Now, he stayed working on there, and by the time we get into the democratic Montenegro regime, he's working to try to decrypt things that hackers are sending back and forth to each other. The novel itself is written a lot like, is written from several different viewpoints where we follow different characters in different chapters. So we get Miguel Sainz running through there. We get a judge who's trying to find out who murdered his cousin during the dictatorship and is following a number of lines of investigation. We have the guy that recruited Turing, who is this Nazi who went to Bolivia and decided to stay there. We have a hacker who's doing anti-globalist activities. We have Miguel Sainz's daughter. We have a whole series of different people. But the novel starts off when Miguel Sainz receives a coded message that when he decrypts it reads, "Asesino, tienes las manos manchadas de sangre." Murder, your hands are stained with blood. And he doesn't really know what that means because he didn't think he'd ever murdered anyone. But there the story begins to just unfold. And it's a novel that's not science fiction. It's based completely in extant technology, but it's all super technological. Half the novel, or nearly half the novel, occurs, for example, in a place called the Playground, which is a fictional version of Second Life, but a Second Life that is internationalized and that people in different countries can buy. What's the word? They can. They can buy it. Somebody can put up the money to make Playground Bolivia or Playground Argentina. And so it becomes this space that people interact in virtually, where they begin to function as these kind of post-human subjectivities, but within a space that always costs money, that always controls their behavior. One of the absolute rules in this playground is that you can't talk about its artificial nature. And if you start to refer to the fact that you're in virtual world, the computer police show up and kick you out of the system. And so what Pozzolan begins to do is tie together hackers, the conversion of the human in code and in bytes, and begins to talk about how we live in this kind of post-human reality now and how that connects back into Sainz's activities in which he would decode messages that ultimately represented the lives of the people that were killed. That is, in both cases, we have a situation in which we as organic subjectivities are converted into numbers. Now we are our credit card numbers. We are the avatars that exist in these different kinds of virtual worlds. Then the leftists were people whose identities were covered up by the coded messages that were sent. And what Edmundo Pozzolan does very well, and you can look through the couple of quotations that I did there, is show how much of what neoliberalism brings with its with globalist ideas, with the kind of grafting of a foreign technology onto the indigenous organic body, is something that in turn produces these kinds of political and social oppression that we saw under the military dictatorship. And so the cyborg for Edmundo Pozzolan becomes a very kind of scary type of figure, one that's there and that's always there, but that carries within it this menace that suggests that just as people disappeared within the military dictatorship, because of the links that tie neoliberalism in, both on the idea of coding, but in the fact that you've got the same president both times, people are disappearing into the technology in a very similar way. And this kind of anti-neoliberalism that appears very strongly in these novels is something that is also engaging with the anti-neoliberalism that starts to spring up at the beginning of this decade, and that then results in Banzer and his successor losing out to Evo Morales, and this kind of new left in Latin America that exists as an answer to the fear of neoliberalism that built up in the 1990s in various Latin American countries. So that's a sense of what I do. These are sections of 2 different chapters of the book. I look at a lot of other things as well. What I'm most fascinated by, and in general in literature, is the way that literature provides us with images and tools to make sense or unmake sense of the societies in which we live. And that as we think about how we are thinking through cyborgs in our own situation, and then see how cyborgs get used to think through important issues in Latin America, we come to a much better understanding not only of the literature, but of the societies that are collaborating in the construction of that literature. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions. Sam.
The Paglia story reminded me most prominently of seance spiritualism, automatic writing, and channeling. Do they toy with notions of spiritualism? Was that ever popular in Latin America? Or have
Oh, absolutely. Paglia is not as involved with that, but in fact, one of the neat little things for your GWhiz file about Argentina is that they have more Lacanian psychoanalysts there that actually practice psychiatry than any other country in the world. And so I bring that up only because of the way that automatic writing is tied in with surrealism and Freudianism. But those ideas have a lot of currency. Paglia is not so much thinking about it that way, but there are a lot of earlier Argentine writers that are thinking it like that. Yeah?
Do you think there will be the idea that like cyborgs or robots are being oppressed by humans and like the TV show like Battlestar Galactica? Do you think there'll be sympathy from humans for being oppressed? Like recently there's been a animal rights movement, and just like in the past few weeks there's been a plants right movement, like in Switzerland.
Sure.
So do you think there'll be sympathy from humans for robots being oppressed, and they'll say, oh, we need to be more, we need to have equality?
My sense is no, and in part it's because where we are going to see these kinds of cyborgs as products of our own, that is, in the whole Battlestar Galactica idea, Cylons are the children of the humans, and they've come back. In Latin America, cybernetic existence is something that always comes from outside. The mechanical and the technological is usually imported. And so it comes at them through an extra filter that then makes these cyborg beings, in the case of the neoliberal and anti-neoliberal views that we see in Pozzolan, are things that are never entirely Latin American, which then becomes a definition of what is Latin American. That is, that it's these aspects that are never entirely that way. And so I think they'd have to overcome that aspect of it. With Paglia, that kind of thinking wouldn't make as much sense because of the way that these cyborgs are so subversive. And so the state is going to want to control them precisely because they represent something that can dismantle the state. And so people are going to be thinking about them more on political terms in terms of what the cyborgs can do than whether they're worried about them being oppressed. But that's an interesting point. It's something that it's that kind of, as you think about this flow of ideas between the Americas, it's one that gets translated fairly heavily and transformed when you think of it about it in a Latin American context. That said, I'm sure that there's science fiction novels in Latin America that think along those lines exactly.
Just within like Latin American literature in general, the ones that are about these cyborgs and stuff. So, is the cyborg kind of serving somewhat as a critique of the neoliberal movements as purported by North America, and then the organic part being kind of a reification of Latin American, the indigenous Latin American aspects of life?
Yeah, so it's kind of the reverse, or it's kind of the taking of the image of Diego Rivera and then saying this isn't that good a thing, from one particular perspective. And Edmundo Pozzolan is kind of in between those, but he does see these kind of post-human subjectivities as something that we might not be able to get away from, but that are not completely good. And so you get a lot of writing along that line. On the same time, you've got some authors that say, well, that's the way it is, and that's actually kind of good. So in another chapter of this, I talk about the Chilean writer Alberto Fuguet and the Argentine writer Rodrigo Fresán, who see this kind of technological and neoliberal world as reality, and actually it's kind of nice in the way that they're thinking through global culture, and the way that for them Latin American culture is not about salsa music and magic realism, but it's about the X-Files and Macintosh computers, and that's a lot of what's at the base of Mecondo, the movement, sort of pseudo-movement that Fuguet kind of suggested as a joke. What's interesting is that while Fuguet and Fresán are very much a part of this yay global culture, Pozzolan, who's a great friend of both of them and was part of the Mecondo group as well, is not nearly so excited about it.
How do you think the law will define being human as technology and organic material continue to cross over? Like where do you think the threshold will be set for you're too robotic, you can't be human anymore? Do you think such a threshold will develop? And then like a follow-up to that is, do you think that will vary by region? Do you think the United States and Latin America will define that differently, that one will be more accepting than the other?
I think absolutely. The thing is, as we're working on it right now, I don't think that there's that much fear. I mean, people kind of think out loud. We're all turning into robots, and at what point do we stop being human? But in reality, what you really see happening is this idea of the human that just keeps growing. And so since nobody's created artificial intelligence yet, since it all still depends on some aspect of the human, my sense is that the definition of human is going to kind of continually encompass these beings that have extra prosthetics in them, but that they're not going to quit being human because they have this aspect that is biological. Now, what will happen when we actually do develop artificial intelligence will be a completely different situation, and I imagine that you will get different ideas and different definitions in different countries.